Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Itachi was interested in having a child. Petunia performs a bit of accidental magic. It says something about her parenting that Uchiha Itachi is considered a better prospect for raising a child. Young Hari is raised by one of the most infamous nukenin of all time and a cadre of uncles whose cumulative effect is very prominent. And someone had the bright idea to bring him back to England. Merlin helps them all. Before we start, kindly like and subscribe to this channel, and look over the description box for the author of this amazing storyline. Welcome aboard. Chapter 29, Detention Explodes. Believe it. Youth. Hari? Yes, Hermione. You just killed a student. And? You just killed a student in front of everyone. My father would be so disappointed. I should hope so. Lesson after lesson, and then I just got someone with everyone watching me. Wait, wah. But that's not much worse than everyone knowing you murdered your whole extended family, is it? If everyone knows you did it, does it really matter that they didn't actually see it? No. Thanks, Hermione. Hari skipped off out a window. No one was surprised that there was no splat. Hari seemed to have a positive genius for finding secret passageways that were disguised as suicide attempts. What just happened? Blaze began. Then he stopped. His mouth opened and closed a few times. I've got nothing. On a separate note, said Daphne, did Hari just say his father murdered his extended family? Technically, no, replied Tracy. True. Pansy was rubbing her face with her hand. He did, however, strongly imply that this was the case. And that his father would be upset with him for killing people in front of witnesses. Which rather suggests that the objection is the witnesses, not the killing. So, Hari is a violent nutter, Millie summed up. Is anyone surprised? A little, yes, said Daphne. The violent part, I mean. Millicent shrugged. I saw him deck my mom so hard her head smashed the ceiling. Oh right. I got the feeling he didn't know she would survive when he hit her. Oh. Natural causes, added Blaze. Daphne looked at him silently for a moment. We really need to get you some help. The headlines in the Prophet the next day read, Scion of prominent family dies to boy who lived in sanctioned lethal duel. The body of the article went on to note that the duel was part of the official curriculum, amended 10 minutes before publication, and that despite the lack of teaching, dueling was technically part of the Hogwarts Charter. A good deal of the evidence that this was not some sort of attempt by known wackadoodle, Albus Percival Wulfric Brian James Charles Frankie Dumbledore, to kill a member of an important family that frequently opposed his actions in the Wizengamot on the grounds that he was a daft old coot and trying to destroy everything we good purebloods hold dear, including the keeping of Muggle chattel. Direct quotes from transcripts of the most recent hearings on the use of compulsion charms on Muggles for extended periods, was that the two staff members who oversaw the duel were 1. Severus Tobias Snape, known dungeon bat, greasy bastard, and all-around asshole, who might be in Dumbledore's pocket after being saved from Azkaban by the man, but never acted like it, and 2. Gilderoy Lockhart, OOM. Second class, KOW, JAH, HYE, BUA, LIO, MCW, DHI, JJJ, OIU, SSJ4, HAK and SWQ, a known dueling master and honorable chap. There could be no question that with Gilderoy Golden Boy Lockhart involved, that everything was on the up and up. There were the calls for Dumbledore to resign from his positions on the grounds that someone had died at a school where one of the classes involved poisons, explosives, and corrosive gases, and the building itself frequently attacked students and teachers alike. And there was one article mentioning that the boy who lived was probably evil or something for having killed, but it was buried somewhere below the adverts for singing corsets and creams that reversed penis enlargement that had gone too far. Considering that the facts of the matter were that someone had been gutted, then bisected, then actually atomized in front of the school, the article was rather mellow. It questioned Dumbledore's competence, but no more than usual. Each and every day usually had at least one editorial that called on him to step down from one or more of his positions. So far, it had resulted in a grand total of nothing at all, and parts of the coverage bordered on positive for teaching the ancient art of dueling. And in a shocking twist, one of the most reactionary of the editorial writers commended Dumbledore for not giving in to the panty-waists of modern thinking and instead continued the traditional methods of dueling instruction, using only lethal combat to weed out the weak. The term used was one that the paper had to redact on the grounds that Mudblood was insufficiently rude to act as a euphemism for what she had written, and she hoped that there would be further efforts on the headmaster's part to winnow down the lot of limp-wrist Nancy boys and, redacted, that Hogwarts was turning out these days. Dumbledore seemed to find the whole thing endlessly entertaining, and spent the entirety of breakfast slapping his thigh as he read sections aloud despite Professor McGonagall's insistence that the language was too salty for impressionable, young ears. The editorials in particular were filled with an impressive degree of bile, and at one point, Dumbledore curtailed his oral recitation when he realized that someone had embedded in the text a ritual to cause the paper to burst into a pile of screaming fire. Harry was suspiciously quiet. The only thing he said to anyone was a comment to Hermione, that he was going to have to step things up in order to find the real one. Harry? Yes, girl Toby? Harry absently swatted her hand away from the sugar bowl on the Slytherin table. You killed someone a few days ago, right? Yep. Isn't that bad? Not when I do it. Oh. Girl Toby's head cocked to the side as she considered that. Then she smiled. Okay. Oh Lord of Cows, cried Gred. Take pity on humble petitioners, added Gred. What can I do for you too? Just wanted to thank you for dealing with Drudine for us. He'd been talking with Ginny, explained Forge. A few times, he cornered her, continued Fred. And she never looked like herself after. We'd been meaning to make him back off, but we've had limited success. Shame you didn't tell me before I killed him. Why? Because then I'd have been able to charge you. Oh. See you two around. Harry waved and walked up a flight of stairs down to the dungeons. Days for Gilderoy Lockhart became distinctly unpleasant. Anything that could go wrong did. His clothes somehow managed to get horribly starched so that he actually crackled when he walked, and he'd accidentally cut a student with the crease in his sleeve. His tooth treatment turned his mouth black, and only application of emergency cosmetics managed to prevent him from having to go outside his rooms like that. He kept tripping too. He sometimes went a whole day unable to walk down a hallway without falling on his face. There was no reason, and Madame Pomfrey could find no sign of any curse on him, not that a schoolchild would be able to manage something so complicated, and so he was wondering if there were some new magical diseases that was causing his loss of balance. And then there was his room. Something was wrong with it. He kept slamming into things when he knew that they hadn't been in the way the day before. It was starting to make him wonder if he were insane. And his creams and ointments kept being shuffled around. He always laid them out in a particular order, but he'd found himself applying the wrong tonic a few times. He'd yet to mix up the depilatory and Beautylox bottles, but it was only a matter of time. Plus, there had been that detention he'd assigned Harry Potter. The staff had been surprised to hear that he expected the boy to show up, but the lad had. The door to Lockhart's office opened and the boy walked in. Why didn't he dress like other students? What was with the red clouds? Sit. You are going to help write answers to my fan mail. The boy had blinked for a moment and then nodded and sat down, taking out some sort of stick. For the first time, Potter paid attention as he'd explained the importance of answering letters and how to properly flatter people without promising anything. He'd also expounded at length on the avoidance of being sued for saying things and how touchy the public could get. It had been quite nice to find that the boy was listening to what he said. Then Potter had silently looked at the stick, which grew a quill nib, and then glanced over his sample letter before opening a stack of fan mail and beginning to work. The first letter was presented for his assessment, and he was astounded to find that it was almost a perfect replica of his letter, and the handwriting was indistinguishable. After that, he sat down to work on his own pile of the stuff. It was satisfying to enjoy the background hum of himself talking to himself and the portraits around his office, with just the sound of scratching quills. They had finally finished the letters, and Lockhart had asked an elf to set them aside to be sent out after New Year's, when people would be especially satisfied to start things off with words from him. "I'm disappointed in you, Professor," Potter said. "What? You didn't come to detention. What are you?" And then the world had gone white. And red. And hot. When he'd come to, the room had been a shambles, splinters were everywhere, and his portraits had been shredded. There had been no sign of the blasted boy. The worst had come when he'd gone to Dumbledore. Despite his accusations, the man had insisted that Harry Potter was incapable of such an act because he'd been breaking into the seventh-year greenhouses to plant something. At midnight. On a Wednesday. Harry? Pansy. As is my solemn duty, Christmas break starts tomorrow. Okay. And none of us are going to invite you to our family homes. Really? Really? Because Blaze's mom sent him a letter inviting me, and so did Millie's. They decided not to extend their parents' invitations. And you can't come to my place anyway, interjected Daphne. My parents will not be happy when I bring Girl Tobga Astoria home. Why? Daphne's eye twitched. Tracy put a hand on her arm. SHH. Calm thoughts, Daph. He doesn't know. Harry shrugged and dismissed it as the workings of the female mind. He nodded to Blaze while moving the maple syrup. Harry had some serious doubts that it actually came from a tree. He suspected it was breakfast syrup, out of Girl Toby's reach, while shoveling some eggs onto her plate. Eat. He smacked her hand. Without sweets. So this year I actually have Christmas gifts for you guys, said Harry over the sound of Astoria's whining. You already had sugar, and you have potions, and I plan to do a bit of exploring. Girl Toby looked down and ate her food sullenly. Tomorrow evening, you can show your parents your new magic on your sister. Girl Toby perked up while Daphne's hand had already gripped a knife, and was in the process of throwing when Tracy shoved her wrist down to the table. Snape was worried that Potter wasn't in his class. For one thing, Girl Toby was making a volatile potion today, and he was constantly waiting for the hissing sound that would mean that most of his students would not be bothering him with dunderhead questions because he'd be in prison, and they'd be bothering their maker. The other reason was that this meant that he didn't know where his most troubling student was. Whenever Potter was out of his sight, there was a nagging feeling that something was going to happen that would become his problem. Harry tapped Madame Pomfrey on the shoulder. She screamed and whirled, trying to cover the seventh year she had been treating for a personal problem. Are you busy? The nurse looked over her shoulder and her patient, and then at Harry. What do you think? Oh good. Harry grabbed her wrist and dragged her over to one of her workbenches. Behind them were the indignant cries of someone who had a pressing issue that was no longer being treated. So I wanted to see if you could work out how to grow any of this. He from his pocket a bit of grayish flesh in the shape of an arm 3 inches long. Madame Pomfrey, despite her inclination to return to her duties, drew her wand and prodded the thing. No, I don't think I can. You should talk to Pomona Professor Sprout. She paused. Can I keep this? She waved her wand a few times. This was attached to a man without magic for a decade, give or take. Interesting how it bonded with him. It has some properties that I want to study. Maybe it could be fashioned into prosthetics when regeneration is too expensive? Or maybe when dark magic has been used. Go ahead and keep it. I have more. But I'd like to get some fresh that wasn't attached to a creepy grave robber. Madame Pomfrey, cried the student. It's moving again. Oh. She tucked the miniature limb into a pocket and bustled off, brandishing her wand. From behind the curtain came roaring sounds. Harry waved genially and trotted off. He was halfway to the greenhouses when he remembered that he'd wanted to ask the medic if possession were a normal thing around these parts. Oh well. It probably wasn't serious. The door to the greenhouse slammed open and Harry burst in. His classmates stared at him in open shock. Not, mind, that he was interrupting a class, but that he was in a herbology class. "Good morning, Professor Sprout." Harry shouldered a grinning Theodore Nott aside, causing him to drop the mandrake he'd been readying to place on a Ravenclaw's shoulder. It hit the ground and began to scream. Everyone stared at Harry, who looked mildly annoyed that someone had interrupted his interruption of a class, but was otherwise unaffected by the sound that should have caused some serious oculoaural hemorrhaging. Harry tried to continue what he'd been saying before realizing that Professor Sprout was wearing earmuffs and wasn't hearing anything. Besides, he couldn't hear himself talk over the noise. Best to fix that. His foot stomped down on the thing's throat, and it changed over to terrified gagging and grasping at the ruin not flesh. Professor Sprout was vibrating with fury until a miniature arm was held up in front of her. Something about it cut off the thought process of rage. Her wand jabbed the thing, and it attempted to swat the intruding object away. "You can have it if you can help me grow some that isn't tainted by grave robbing. Let me know." He tucked the arm back in his pocket and left the greenhouse where Terence Boot was busily performing CPR on a mandrake. The faculty waved to the Hogwarts Express as it chugged its way out of Hogsmeade. Most of them had varying degrees of pleasure on their faces at the fact that for the next 2 weeks, there would be comparative peace in the castle. The only downside was that there had been a further petrification that morning. It wasn't really a big issue, but it was starting to get a bit silly, they felt. "I'm going to need to take a short trip into London." Several professors jumped, clutching their chests. Snape just shook his head though. Dumbledore nodded amiably. "Of course, my boy. I assume you have some last-minute Christmas ST shopping to do?" In a manner of speaking, Professor Headmaster. Harry began to jog along the train tracks. "Headmaster?" "Yes, Minerva?" "Shouldn't we ask for a little more detail about his plans?" "Not unless you want to be called as a witness," muttered Snape. That pretty much killed conversation for the morning. Chapter 30, 'Tis the Season of Giving, of Headaches and Bleeding Wounds. Harry stopped in at the pet store and actually purchased things, because somehow it seemed right for this one. Besides, the man behind the counter was just too polite to rob blind. Today. Tomorrow was another matter. Though as a ninja, money was a rather silly thing to bother having, since they rarely paid for things. He waved to the nice man and left the door, dodging around a heavily cloaked figure who had 3 scarves obscuring her face. It might have made it hard to spot her if he hadn't been in possession of the Byakugan. Apparently, someone was a senjutsu master in this world. He had to stop in at a hardware store for several things, then it took some time to track down a box of Turkish Delight in Diagon. It still left a couple of gifts though. Thankfully, an obscure book he found moldering in the back of a shop answered both problems at once. Though it did mean that most of his day was taken up with sitting in front of an oven. Fwoosh. Not again. Hermione's father groaned as the ball of fire erupted in his living room on Christmas morning. The boy with the attitude that mixed juvenile delinquent with violent maniac was holding a wrapped gift. Why was he here? Honey? Yes, Dad? Hermione was eyeing her friend with suspicion. Why is he here? It's nice to see you again, Mr. and Mrs. Hermione's parents. Harry bounded across the room and shook their hands violently, balancing the gift on his head so he could manage both at the same time. Merry Christmas, Hermione. He paused. Though I'm not sure what this is about, other than gifts. He held out the heavy tome. What's this? Open it. Get out. Hermione's father was a little annoyed that someone was intruding on Christmas without so much as a by your leave. Fwoosh. Dad? Yes, Hermione. Is this Winston Churchill's collected speeches? Maybe? Probably not, she concluded. Hermione decided not to weigh her father down with the fact that they were now in possession of the originals of the works in question. Hi, Mr. Millicent's dad, who I never got to meet before. Harry shook the hand of the large, brutish man cheerfully as he balanced on the man's head with his free hand, having just avoided a drop kick that had dented the spell-enforced stone floor. He lashed out with his leg and sent the woman who was dressed as a naughty elf flying across the room, where she shattered a credenza. Nice to meet you, replied the man with a certain degree of slowness. In most people, it would have suggested birth defects or being hit in the head a lot. In his case, it was a sign of considerable intelligence compared to his kin. That or he was that rare kind of person who really did think through everything he did very carefully, and did everything with a good deal of deliberation. Harry? Yes, Millie? Harry was casually dodging the increasingly violent attacks by his friend's mother. Hold still so I can hit you. What are you doing here? She had to keep from snickering as her mother overbalanced when Harry had abruptly stopped completely and her next swing caused her to land on him. So he tossed her to her husband, who restrained her with a practiced air. Giving you your present. Harry had to raise his voice slightly over the hissing and roaring from the blonde who was being easily cradled in such a way that she couldn't manage to get to anything with her flailing limbs. Harry handed his friend a wrapped object and then vanished in a ball of fire. Millicent unwrapped the object and blinked because her mother was suddenly next to her, cooing. She held in her hands a cricket bat with nails hammered through it. What a thoughtful boy. I like him. Millicent hit her mother with the bat. Harry landed in the middle of a Christmas breakfast. Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Daphne and Girl Toby's parents. He proceeded to accost both adults, shaking their hands vigorously while avoiding the croissant Daphne lobbed at him. Merry Christmas. Harry. There was suddenly a small, ballistic blonde wrapped around his waist. He patted the squealing head. She's been like this all morning, snarled Daphne. Her mother had apparently missed the tone, because she had shifted things around to set a fifth place at the table, and was busily moving food onto a plate. Her father, meanwhile, was looking at Harry with suspicion. I was so glad to be able to help Girl Toby just after Daphne made her come up to Hogwarts, Harry offered as he sat down and considered the meal, looking to see if there was anything he liked to eat. He speared the sausage link out of the air with a fork and frowned in distaste before depositing it on Girl Toby's plate. Daphne, snapped her mother. You know better than to throw food at the table. Her daughter's twitching seemed to go unnoticed, as she turned to Astoria and smiled. We're so proud our daughter is already coming along so well with her studies. How did you get her by Dumbledore? Her Daphne's father asked, fixing Daphne with his second-best parental glare. He noted his daughter's brightening ears and the fire building in her eyes. Dumbledore said she was an early transfer student, Harry explained. How has your break been, Girl Toby? You do know her name is, began Daphne's father. Girl Toby, do you want your present? There was a deafening squeal. I'll take that as a yes. He whistled and the slightly larger phoenix burst into the air with a pair of boxes. One was as large as an SUV. It had holes poked in it and as it landed, shook slightly. The other was about the size of a book. It landed on Harry's head. Harry scowled at the bird as it vanished. Then he held out the small box to Astoria. Here you go, Girl Toby. He gestured at the large box. That's for you, Daphne. The phoenix landed on his shoulder and they vanished. Astoria tore open her gift with the zeal of the truly hyper. Paper and box went flying in every direction. From the remains, she extracted a little note saying, "Study." Then she searched the debris and found a mask made of an orange and red swirl with a hole for her right eye. She put it on immediately and laughed. Daphne, meanwhile, prodded the box gently with a knife. It shook again. She closed her eyes and hoped that her friend hadn't decided that a Nunda would make a good house pet. Then she climbed onto the table and opened the box. At first, she thought it was empty, then she realized there was a note in the exact center of the bottom. Practice is its own reward. I expect progress come term. P.S. Feed it at least twice a day. The box was now distressingly empty. Tracy Davis was amused to watch Hari appear in a ball of fire and instantly fall to the ground as 3 magnum rounds went straight through where he had been. The really amusing part was that her mother then holstered the weapon and apologized for not recognizing him before shooting. "Good morning, Mr. Tracy's father." "Good morning, Mrs. Trigger Happy Tracy's mother." Hari managed to stand up from his prone position without bending anything. He leaned over to the red-headed woman. "On an unrelated note, if you ever want something of a larger caliber, I can arrange that." There was an audible gulp from the other two as they contemplated the idea of the woman having more dangerous weapons. As it was, she was already at the maximum lethality available on the civilian market, and that only because of prodigious use of magic at the licensing office to convince them that she could have that many guns. The only options left would be military grade. That was not good for their mellow. "I was stopping in to wish you lot a Merry Christmas and give Tracy her gift." He pulled a small, flat box from his pocket and dropped it into her lap. He waved to her mother. Then he unsealed his barrette from his forearm and brandished it. "Remember, if you want to up caliber, I can help you out." The weapon vanished in a cloud of smoke, and then Hari vanished in a cloud of fire. Tracy slowly opened the small gift, and her eyes widened slowly. "Holy Merlin. I'm still not sure why you don't blaspheme like a normal person," grumbled her mother. "I mean, I gave enough goddamn examples. It's not like Merlin is even really blasphemy anyway. It's not like he was a ghost." She stopped mid-word when her daughter held up a bracelet of perfectly matched gray pearls. "I'm going to assume that's impressive?" her father asked. A finger tried to stroke Hari's chin the moment he landed, and it was only at the last moment that he kept his fist from striking Blaze's mother in retaliation as he dodged. "I'm so glad you decided to stop in," she purred. "I was so upset when Blaze said you wouldn't be coming by." She was wearing a house dress that left a good bit to the imagination of people who couldn't see through it. She gestured to a man staring in shock at the boy, who had just appeared in a blast of fire. "Please meet my latest husband, Baron Klaus von Stryf." Hari grabbed the man's unresisting hand and pumped it violently. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Blaze's 7th dad. I'm amazed to see you haven't encountered natural causes yet." "We just had the ceremony yesterday," said Cersei. "We were waiting to celebrate until after Christmas." "Makes sense." The Baron was looking increasingly confused and mildly distressed at the way the conversation was progressing. His new wife patted his hand gently. "I understand you had some experience with them at school recently." "I suppose." Hari sprawled out on a couch and shrugged. "I usually think of it as business as usual." "Are we your first stop?" asked Blaze. "As much as Mum would like to think you're making a special visit to see her," he glared over at the woman in question, who gave an innocent look that just sat wrong on sensual features. "I assume you're visiting everyone." "Actually, you're second to last." I pulled names out of a hat. Hari replied. "Saving Daphne for last, then?" "Nah. Already got there." Hari looked at the clock against the wall. "I've got another stop to make." He rose and pulled a long box from under his robe. Hari tore the package open and extracted a thin rapier. Then he turned and in a swift movement, speared the Baron through the heart. He drew the blade back and wiped it on the man's jacket. "Sorry about giving you a used gift." He gave Blaze the weapon, hilt first, and then was gone in a ball of fire. "Such a sweet boy." Blaze sighed. Then he grinned. "Natural causes?" Natural causes. Good afternoon. Harry landed feet first in the roast pig on the Parkinson's table, sending food bits everywhere. He reached down and grabbed the thoroughly resisting hands of Pansy's parents, and shook them so vigorously that they were lifted nearly out of their seats. So good to see you again, Mr. and Mrs. Pansy's parents. I'm glad I can count on your undying friendship after saving you from a fate worse than death. Pansy had gone horribly pale. Her parents hadn't noticed yet that she was uncontaminated by food. 2 years of meals with Harry meant that she was quickly honing her ability to dodge airborne food particles. Hello, Harry. Hey, Pansy. He frowned for a moment. Don't forget to offer your condolences to Blaze. What? He just lost his stepfather. Tragic case of natural causes. Harry sat down in a miraculously clean seat and began to help himself to some grilled trout. I didn't get a chance to eat yet today, so I'm glad you lot are having a meal. He seemed utterly oblivious to the twin glares coming from across the table. I've been all over this island, you know. Oh, thanks. The last was directed at the house elf who had just given him a bowl of steamed rice. I'm already at the point where I won't ask why Mopsy would get you food, mumbled Pansy as she returned to her food, studiously ignoring her parents, since they seemed to be in states of apoplectic shock. Because she's a good elf? I suppose. Though I think a good elf should be able to identify welcome guests. Come again? Nothing. So, I got you a gift. Thanks. You're welcome. Harry pointed over his shoulder. I left it outside your place. It's not so great for indoors. He rose. I made sure it's full, so you just need to find someone to teach you to use it properly. He finished eating and rose. Have fun. If you need a lift to London, send me a note. There was a ball of fire, and then there wasn't a boy who annoyed. Pansy went outside. Sitting there was a gleaming, brand-new motorcycle. Professor McGonagall had just finished opening her presents when a house elf appeared with a box. Mr. HarryPotter sends this with his bestest wishes, Professor Kitty. I thought I told you to stop calling me that. Of course, Deputy Headmistress Kitty. She sighed and covered her eyes for a moment. Somehow, she had the feeling this was James Potter's revenge for all those detentions. It was just the kind of prank that boy would have found hilarious, the kind where he wouldn't have bothered denying it because he was too busy laughing at his own humor. All right. Let's see what he got me this time. Something warned her away from opening the box directly, so she stepped back a few paces. Then she moved back rather further and conjured a block of stone to stand behind. That was better. A few waves of her wand undid the wrapping, and then split the seams of the box to let it fall open. Professor McGonagall's eye began to twitch. Not even James Potter had this kind of cheek. Then she amended her thoughts to realize it had been more that he didn't have the sack. James Potter had been afraid of her anger. His son had bought her a scratching post. Professor Headmaster Dumbledore was looking at his open gifts forlornly. He had opened them and received a great many books he looked forwards to reading, but he had been hoping that young Harry would find some of those marvelous Muggle confections. No matter how many times he asked, the boy was frustratingly silent on his source. Still, he had plenty of wonderful things, and was grateful for them. There was a pop, and a house elf holding a small box was standing on his desk. Harry Potter sends this to Professor Headmaster Many Names, Professor Headmaster Dumbledore, sir. The old man snorted back laughter as he took the box and opened it. Inside was what appeared to be a large, thin rectangle of treacle. A note had been attached to the wrapping, and Dumbledore picked it up and skimmed it. Then he smiled and tore free a small corner of his gift. Professor Snape sipped a cup of black coffee with a few shots of scotch in it. He had always preferred Irish whiskey, but Minerva had caught him once and never let him hear the end of it, so he stuck with her preferred brand nowadays. A house elf popped in next to his chair. What did Potter get me? Compliments of how did you know, Professor Wayne? Just a suspicion. And I'm still sure that he got you lot started on that. Snape picked up the gift-wrapped book. It was so old that it had begun to crumble before someone applied preservation charms. Ye old confectioner's guidey book? The man had a slight scowl on his face as he opened the book. A note fell out. He read the note and then began to read the book with renewed interest. There was a slight smile on his face. Professor Dumbledore had just replaced his usual pointed hat with a multicolored propeller beanie when Madame Pomfrey stormed into the great hall, her usual bustle modulated with radiating anger. The few students who had dragged themselves away from their shiny new toys shrank back. Professor Snape was grateful that he'd had a few extra shots in his current cup of coffee. He couldn't deal with this sober. Dumbledore cocked his head and gave his Medewitch a smile. Headmaster, she snarled. I just spent the better part of the morning dealing with Christmas gifts. The look on Dumbledore's face clearly said that he wasn't following why that was a bad thing. Someone sent Professor Lockhart this. She threw a box onto the single table that they were eating on, knocking the scrambled eggs about. It took me an hour just to get his mouth open so I could see why there was blood pouring out. Everyone looked down at the box. It contained Turkish Delight. Each piece had been split open to show that nested inside was a razor blade with a small dot of brown goo stuck to it. Say something, Dumbledore. The man shrugged and smiled, showing teeth joined together. I do believe that Professor Dumbledore is enjoying some lockjaw treacle, said Professor Snape. The headmaster nodded vigorously. Then held up his hands and began to move them oddly. And he's out of practice using sign language, so it'll be a while before he says anything at all. Madame Pomfrey stormed back out. I wonder if the same person sent the buffoon the gift sent you yours, headmaster, murmured Snape. The headmaster's gestures were not found in any traditional form of sign language, but were clearly dismissive, though of the thought or of that being an issue was hard to say. When the headmaster produced a long tube and began to suck up cranberry sauce through it, Snape decided to let the matter drop. Chapter 31, that plot thread I mentioned earlier. Harry is going to be the death of me, hissed Pansy when they had all boarded the train back to school. After he offered to arm my mother? Replied Tracy. I doubt it. Daphne had begun to shudder slightly at the thought of Tracy's mother with anything that Harry thought was a good idea to have. He got me a motorcycle, snapped Pansy. And a manual for it. That's incredibly dangerous. Hermione gasped. I know. My parents were seriously considering beating me over it. You're too young to DRIO. Oh wow. That's horrible. It could have been worse, said Pansy. I mean, they might have actually done it. They tried to destroy the bike, but it kept repairing itself. And every time they locked it up, that crazy phoenix of Harry's dropped it into the yard again. She sighed. I'm probably going to have to learn to ride it quickly. I don't want to imagine him helping. Why wouldn't you want Harry to help? Squeaked girl Toby. She hadn't taken the mask off since it had been given to her. Because then she might get the monster pet that needs to be fed twice a day, and that none of us have any idea where it is or why it hasn't eaten what we put out for it, and so it's probably starving to death, and then we'll need to explain that to him. Or worse, it's found something else to eat. Harry got you something other than a note? Asked Hermione. Some kind of huge monster, from the size of the box. And it's invisible and doesn't like the food we've left out. Our parents didn't believe us when we said that if Harry said to feed it, we had best do so, which meant they kept complaining about the food bowl. But he got you something other than a note. Trade you? Hermione considered. No. I think I'm good, thanks. As it is, I'm in possession of stolen property. Me too, said Blaze. Harry gave me a rapier to go with the dagger from last year, and we worked out that it belonged to one of the kings of England, damned if I remember which one though. And it's really sharp too. Natural causes. He looked at them. What? That probably means that his gifts to the rest of us are stolen too, huh? Tracy looked at the bracelet on her wrist. Probably. Hermione said. Tracy shrugged. Oh well. What do you mean oh well? He killed someone in front of us. What's a little stealing for friends? Hermione closed her eyes and began to mutter something about how she had been law-abiding and fell in with a bad crowd. Harry wondered about the lateness of the presents that had arrived on his ceiling that morning. Perhaps his visits had derailed their thought processes. He wasn't sure there was another reason for getting the gifts several weeks late. Hermione had sent him a complete copy of the British Legal Code with some note about paying attention to it, but he forgot about it almost instantly. Blaise had sent him a copy of the death certificate of his most recent stepfather, as well as a copy of the will leaving everything to his mother. Tracy had sent him a rifle cleaning kit. And a note from her mother asking for a larger caliber of handgun. Millie's gift contained some untainted Turkish delight and some more tea. Pansy had sent a list of the number of ways her parents had attempted to destroy or hide her gift. Daphne and girl Toby hadn't sent anything, but Harry guessed that they were busy practicing, and that was okay. Dumbledore had sent him a book on teaching with a note reading Sybil said something. Professor McGonagall had sent a detention slip that he forged to apply to Malfoy and dropped on the boy's bed. Welcome back, Dumbledore smiled. Well, except for Mr. Zacharias Smith, he was stupid enough that he managed to get himself petrified between the entrance hall and the Great Hall. How he managed to do that in 20 feet is beyond even my considerable wisdom. We are glad to have everyone here for lunch, other than Professor Lockhart, who is finishing his recovery after eating a sweet with a razor blade in it. I would like to thank whoever sent it, since it has finally proved that all those parents who worried about such things were right. Thanks. The next morning, Gilderoy Lockhart was eating thin porridge, anything else being too much stress for his tongue. The great hall was abuzz with chatter when the doors swung open and slammed into the walls. Standing there were 24 Aurors, led by a stately witch with graying red hair. Auntie? Gilderoy Lockhart. Harry nodded in appreciation. The woman's voice had the appropriate mix of volume and implied threat of things best not thought. You are under arrest. And that effectively silenced the great hall. The Aurors stormed up the way to the head table and several of them grabbed the man, who had remained seated with his spoon halfway to his mouth, frozen in shock. They started to drag the man away. Madam Bones, said Dumbledore, serving himself some scrambled eggs. Might I ask why you are arresting my defense, Professor? You may. Madam Bones. He's being arrested for, dear Merlin, what a list. Right at the top is the threat to disembowel the Minister of Magic, and I quote use your intestines for a condom while I fuck your wife and mistress on your grave. That one was a pretty good reason on its own, honestly. Then there were the requests that several young girls send him nude pictures of themselves. I assure you that they were not old enough to be thinking of such things. He threatened to blow up someone's house after tying up everyone the person knew and stacking them inside the building like cords of firewood. Then there was the one that exploded, destroying the woman's gown in the middle of a crowded restaurant. She's already got dozens of lewd propositions. Madam Bones covered her eyes for a moment. That's all? Madam Bones twitched. No. It isn't. There were almost a score of various threats of rape against everyone the recipient knew, including pets. I think the Daily Prophet is running that one on the front page, by the way. Also, I think there was one that was addressed to the Queen that said that if she didn't knight him, he'd do in her family, starting with Diana. And there was the one sent to the Prime Minister, who was most displeased to be getting magical hate mail talking about some recent unpleasantness with a pig in a car, and that Mr. Lockhart would reveal to the world the Prime Minister's own interest in barnyard creatures unless he was given a cabinet post. Oh, and I got one also, unsolicited, by the way, that told me that I would be, well, let's just say that I would be unhappy for an extended period followed by graphic and public death. Oh, and it blew up my office 5 minutes after I had stepped out to gather my troops. I see. Well, I guess you'll be taking him to Azkaban then? Merlin, no. Have you met his lawyer? She's insane. He's being removed from positions near children until I can manage to convict his sick ass, and then I'll put him in Azkaban. She lowered her voice. But I suspect he's going to trip a lot on the way to the ministry. And he'll try to escape on his way to prison. From outside the great hall was the sound of someone in heavy chains tripping face first on an even stone floor over and over. Clumsy bugger, isn't he, Dumbledore? Most lacks in his balance skills, indeed. Madame Bones looked up at the windows. And that's my cue to leave, she said as a horde of owls came winging in with red envelopes. Dear Merlin, muttered Daphne. She reflexively turned to check what form of chaos Harry was adding to the mess and discovered that he was gone. Oh no. She looked frantically around the great hall as the owls began to land beside Dumbledore. Harry was nowhere to be seen. Moments later, the hall became an echo chamber for some of the most impressively varied filth and bile ever spewed from the average citizen's mouth. Dumbledore had begun to cut a banger into pieces to eat, his conjured earmuffs apparently keeping out all the sound. Professor Sprout had managed to pull out the pair she kept with her at all times, since the mandrakes were getting restless these days, and was staring in horror at the great hall. Most of the students had passed out instantly, and Professor Sprout raced from her seat to shift faces out of porridge before students could suffocate. Ron Weasley was bleeding from his ears and unconscious, but his fork and mouth were still moving just fine. Professor Sprout struggled desperately to get Goyle's head out of his plate of scrambled eggs, eventually resorting to a banisher to fling the boy back. The few students who hadn't been outright felled by the cacophony were bleeding from every facial orifice and trying to stop the sound from doing further damage. The few who could see were not reassured by almost the entire faculty being in a similar state. Except for their headmaster, who seemed quite unaware of all of this, being busy trying to find an egg that was poached to his satisfaction. Harry strolled along a secret passage. Those Aurors had been odd. He'd said hello and offered to hold Lockhart in place, so they could have him trip into their boots some more, but they'd gotten all sheepish and hurried out. Freaks. He admired the way that Lockhart's office was shut tight with spells. The traps they had on the inside of the door were especially nice. He made sure to remember what they looked like as he began to go through the man's desk. There wasn't much there, what with the damage his clone had done, but he was strongly considering planting some evidence, although what he could possibly add after that set of letters? Who was he kidding? Of course, he could add more incrimination. Uncle Sasori had trained him well and Uncle Toby had a positive genius for it. But he didn't really see the point of it. Maybe it would draw the real one out? No. Lockhart wasn't a target, so this wasn't a matter of insufficient kill. He didn't need to go over the top. Besides, seeing how the man fought this would be interesting. If nothing else, the real one would have to come out of hiding to do the job properly instead of letting the idiot body double fail at it and get whatever it was they did around here to people who bothered with law enforcement as something other than target practice. There were the lesson notes the man had, but those were probably best used as lavatory accessories, so he didn't bother. He didn't need transfiguration fodder either. The ruins of the room didn't offer a lot. He considered taking the picture frames, just to tweak the Aurors' noses. Nah. That would be immature. Instead, he wrote nice security on the wall in pig's blood. Lockhart's chambers, on the other hand. Harry went through more expensive, foppish attire than he had ever wished to see as he pawed over the man's belongings. There were a dozen half-finished manuscripts that he took on principle, and there was also the Lockhart brand solid gold comb that he decided to give to Uncle Kakazo to mess with him. There were also a bunch of high-quality writing supplies. Harry didn't use quills, preferring the anachronistic ballpoint, but he stole them anyway, because he knew he should be taking valuables if he didn't want to be lectured by Uncle Kakazo about money and his father about not wasting things. The man also had an interesting collection of women's underwear. Harry pocketed the lot and finished his work by short-sheeting the bed and setting up a basic shuriken trap at the door. An hour later, the entire aulry was empty, the residents winging away with multiple stops to make. Each. Potter. Harry was sitting on his bed, waiting politely. Yes, Professor? I do wish you would be asleep so I could wake you up. You did, Professor. Snape paused for a moment and then decided not to get dragged into this. We have a meeting with the headmaster. At 3 a.m? He just informed me that it's my problem. That makes it your problem. Harry shrugged. 10 minutes later, they were sitting in front of Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. The man was wearing a neon pink nightshirt and his head-eating nightcap. He raised a spindly arm and began to gesture wildly. Professor? Asked Harry. I think it's a form of Japanese Sign Language. Professor Dumbledore nodded happily and gave a huge smile, showing teeth glued together by lockjaw treacle. He gesticulated again. I'm going to say that he is repeating his earlier statement that since Professor Lockhart is currently indisposed, I am to teach defense in addition to my usual potions courses. The response of a random waving of a hand did nothing to enlighten. Since I don't really want to teach 2 full course loads, I am faced with a problem. Problem, Professor Snape? I am dealing with the result of my policy regarding my problems and your problems. Still not following you. I'm fairly certain that the mess with the blonde moron was somehow your fault. That means that my first instinct is to make you sort it out. The problem is that this would make you temporary defense professor. Harry cocked his head. But I will only allow that if you promise that no students will die as a result of your class, under the broadest possible definition of the phrase. And no, that does not mean that just killing them is allowed. So you want me to teach them things that don't require actual combat? Come to think of it? Yes. Harry frowned. In deference to my own sanity and my desire to avoid the Board of Governors nailing my hide to a barn door, we are going to give you a month to prepare and severely reducing the number of classes to once every fortnight. All right. All right. Harry considered for a moment. I'll manage. Merlin, muttered Snape. We're all doomed. Chapter 32, Teaching is Hard on Others. Good morning, class. Harry was sitting on the desk of the defense classroom, smiling at the second years. Harry, quit messing around, snapped Daphne. Harry grinned. No joke. I'm filling in for Professor Psycho. Taped to the wall behind him was the cover of the Daily Prophet with the headlines detailing Lockhart's many crimes. Harry was quite impressed with their detail. Somehow, they had managed to add things that he knew he hadn't written. For one thing, he would have remembered having Lockhart confess to being in charge of the Mafia and the Rotfong conspiracy. It was funny how when presented with enough apparent facts to satisfy any number of muckrakers, they somehow still managed to decide that they needed to fabricate stuff. And who would? Daphne trailed off. Dumbledore. Of course. Indeed. And today we will be learning about disabling enemies. As those of you who attended the dueling club know, a disabled enemy is a dead enemy waiting to happen, and a great deal easier to manage than going straight from fighting to corpse. What? We are going to discuss the various joints and ligaments that are most vital to combat readiness, with special focus on the ways to break, dislocate, or tear them in ways difficult to heal without potions and overnight treatment. To help with this task, I've brought Alan here. Harry reached behind the desk and drew out a man wearing tattered fatigues in bright orange. There was a dark patch over the man's crotch and down his legs. His beard and hair were unkempt and he was looking around in horror. He has happily offered to assist in my demonstrations. Please, God, someone help me. The man began to sob. First, a simple method of rendering silence. Harry's hand snapped out into the man's neck and he began to gurgle as his eyes rolled back in his head. Good. Now, everyone put their books away and gather around. The class came closer warily, not sure about the man who had begun to have tears run down his face. So who knows which are the most important joints? Harry looked around. No one? He sighed. I guess we're starting from scratch. He drew out his tanto from his shoulder and twirled it. This is the hip joint. Albus. Professor Dumbledore was eating a toffee when Poppy stormed into his office with a thunderous look on her face. She was brandishing a list whose heading informed that it was the sheet with the names of those who had visited the hospital wing. It trailed behind her out the door. Yes, Poppy? That person you have teaching defense has traumatized the entire student body. He held out his hand for the list. Even himself? What? Mr. Potter is a member of the student body, therefore I assume that you are saying he has traumatized himself. Dumbledore began to scan the names. Of course, he hasn't, Albus. The boy seems to be quite cheerful. Well then, I'm sure that you're exaggerating. I grant you that Mr. Zabini has yet to visit, but that's it. I'm out of dreamless sleep and calming draught. I've been forced to order more from St. Mungo's, and you know how much they charge. And I have Severus brewing them in every class. Well, there's a certain amount of adjustment that needs to be made to a new teaching style. Not that much. Dumbledore shook his head. Do you have someone else in mind who can do the job? I'm not allowed to hire faculty mid-year. It's in the rules the Board of Governors dictated to us. So I need someone who wants to teach for free. Any ideas? Well, because I don't know of anyone qualified. Potter isn't. And neither is anyone else I can think of, Severus notwithstanding, but at least he's convenient and the students won't need to learn a new face so late in the year. New face? Yes. I know that young people can have such trouble with changes to their routines, so I think it best that the new professor be someone they can already recognize. You're missing my point, Albus. Perhaps. Do keep me up to date on our potion stock. Madame Pomfrey screamed something unintelligible and stomped out, pausing only long enough to kick over Fox's stand, sending the squawking bird flying into the fireplace. A week and 3 boring petrifications later, breakfast contained an unusual disturbance. A strange pair entered the great hall. The sound of the door opening was lost under the usual chaos of mealtime at Hogwarts, which had been amplified several times over by an ongoing feud between Girl Toby and Ronald Weasley over who had first dibs on the syrup. While Girl Toby's wandless magic was ahead of Ron's wand skills, he had a distinct advantage in being raised in a house with a half-dozen hellions and a mother who had lungs of brass. He was used to treating what most people would consider shouting as a way to just speak normally to someone next to him. In the case of needing to raise his voice, he could bellow at such volumes that even Girl Toby's best efforts couldn't manage to drown him out. It didn't mean he got the syrup, but he at least was able to make his displeasure clear. And sometimes, he just grabbed the thing and started pouring. Things had escalated such that Ron was now waking up early on class days, so that he could beat the absurdly chipper young girl to the table and get a chance at food. There were bets on how soon he would bring a sleeping bag into the Great Hall to try for an ultimate edge. Some people had suggested asking for more syrup from the elves, but had been told at the decibel levels used for gunfire that the suggestion was a silly one and this was a matter of pride. Today, Ron had managed enough syrup that he wasn't completely without it for his pancakes, although he had been forced to hold his stack down with one hand while he ate so they would stop floating off. Girl Toby was somehow not covered in food, although the immediate area was now sticky, and she was messily devouring waffles today, having ceded the pancakes to Ron this time. No one was clear why the house elves didn't just make more, but some were of the opinion that it was so that the two would fight and make a big mess for the elves to clean up. The only people who were close to either of the pair were both occupied also. Neville might have been raised by his grandmother, but he was currently reading a book on potions that had been recommended by Professor Snape and had donned a pair of earmuffs stolen from the greenhouses to allow him something resembling peace. Because of that, he was eating behind a massive tome and hadn't the slightest clue that someone he knew was there. It was probably just as well, since she would not have recognized him with a book about potions in front of him, and a look of intense interest on his chubby face. The other person was actually in hospital after taking a book to the back of his head again. Draco Malfoy had been carted off by Crabbe earlier in the meal when Hermione had been trying to convince Harry to maybe spare the first years the full course load of his teaching style, and had been forced to throw a book to get his attention. Not only hadn't it worked, but it had sent the blonde idiot into the strawberries just as he'd been about to take a bite of food. A berry had lodged itself in his throat, and although it had been removed before his already pitiable brain could be damaged further, he had been feeling quite unwell, and so was resting somewhere that Hermione Granger didn't visit, and where he hoped he might avoid being smacked for a few days. The two swept up to the head table, where they lowered their voices to prevent anyone hearing them. So Harry read their lips. "Dumbledore," snapped Lucius Malfoy. "Ah, Lucius." Dumbledore didn't look up from his poached egg. "To what do I owe the visitation at my castle before I have finished breaking my fast?" "You know why. Because you wish to commend me for my stellar fashion sense?" Dumbledore had dissected the egg and somehow moved the liquid yolk to a piece of toast. "Perhaps because you wish to enroll again because you miss the discipline of school?" Lucius Malfoy was slowly going pale and managing to purple at the same time. Severus Snape had busied himself with cutting his toast into soldiers, so that he didn't show the smirk he had on his face. Minerva McGonagall wasn't even trying. "You did spend an awful lot of time in detention with me," she put in. "Please, Minerva, I didn't wish to touch on his deviances, there are children here. I merely thought that the life of a rich man with no responsibilities or duties who doesn't sleep with many women must be lacking in any kind of focus. I fully understand, old boy, that you haven't much interest in the opposite sex, it happens. But you should really find something to do with your time in that case. Perhaps you could take up crochet?" Dumbledore had yet to look up, so the statements appeared to be coming from a deerstalker cap done in eye-watering green and yellow plaid with orange smiley faces on it. "Maybe you just missed my glowing presence and the warmth of my omnipresent sanity?" Lucius screamed incoherently for almost a full minute, managing to be heard over the entire hubbub and, as a result, causing complete silence as everyone searched for what had driven Professor Snape up the wall this time, and why Harry had done it. "That's a most unhealthy scream you have," continued Dumbledore. "Perhaps Madame Pomfrey should take a look at you before you leave?" Lucius's companion was feeling quite uncomfortable about the fact that the man was just finishing a primal shriek. "Could you tell me what you are doing here, disturbing my meal in my castle?" "You're getting the sack, Dumbledore." Augusta Longbottom was dowager of a fated nobility. There weren't really nobles anymore, but if there had been, she would have been matriarch of an important family. She carried herself like a woman of a certain age who had become comfortable with herself and dressed for practicality rather than beauty. And there was the hat. Most of the students were wondering when she had stolen it from Dumbledore. "I'm sorry, Augusta?" Dumbledore asked, his voice confused. "At least for the rest of the year." The woman's tone was suddenly somewhat conciliatory. "I am sorry, Headmaster. There's been too much this time. Your choice of defense instructors has been called into question first, eh? Well, there are accusations anyway. Augusta Longbottom might be important, but offending Lockhart's lawyers was just asking for more trouble than she needed. And now you have a student teaching a class. And one who is quite insane, may I add. If even half of what is being said about the class is true." Dumbledore looked up. "That is a most interesting point of view, Augusta." Augusta Longbottom held out a scroll 2 feet wide and 8 inches thick, sealed with the Hogwarts signet. "The papers." "All right then. Dumbledore considered the pair, taking the roll of parchment almost absently. "Good day. Remember, you deranged old bastard, snarled Lucius Malfoy, you're out. You're finished. You're finally gone. You really look unwell, Lucius, Dumbledore replied as the man was towed away by the Lady Longbottom. Do have a safe trip home. When they were gone, Dumbledore looked around at the assembled students. Get back to eating. You have class 5 minutes ago. Your professors will expect you only 10 minutes late. He paused. Why are you still staring? Aren't you sacked? Called out a voice. No, Mr. Duragid, I am not. But you do have a detention for the next week, helping Filch clean the litter boxes for his new kittens. He smiled broadly. My former students are such jokers. Moody? A house elf appeared. For some reason, it had a blue eye that whirled around in its head. Would you please frame this and put it in the entrance hall? I want everyone to see that even the stodgy old bores of our society know how to play a prank on their old headmaster. Suddenly everyone but Harry felt themselves been pushed into their seats by some unspeakable, oppressive weight. As if they could really throw me out of my castle. The weight vanished. And now, off to class. About 3 weeks ago, Toby was walking around the tower in a pair of towels. One was around his waist, the other was covering his head. Has anyone seen Toby's spare mask? Itachi looked up from his latest attempt to understand what was supposedly going on in Konoha. Why was there some sort of chaos going on when Uzumaki Naruto wasn't even there anyway? Why? Do you need it? Toby's mask is being cleaned. Toby's mask got bloody when he had to choke a bitch. Oh. Toby squeezed so hard her eyes popped. Oh. So where is Toby's mask? I think Harry had it. When was that? Before he went back to school. He was packing his seals. I'm going to kill him. Suddenly, Itachi was standing an inch from the man, eyes whirling in seven-pointed stars. Touch my son and I'll get you, Madara or not. Toby sticks to pranks. Itachi's eyes returned to normal Sharingan, and he smiled slightly. Glad to hear it. Chapter 33, that plot thread strikes again. As does the air. And Gred and Forge. And the air again. Things fell into something of a routine for the denizens of Hogwarts, albeit one that had certain random components. Students and staff alike sort of got used to the fact that every few days, a student turned up petrified. In a departure from his earlier position, Dumbledore suggested that if this continued into next year, he would investigate having a study done to evaluate what could be considered as options for assessing what might be valid actions for addressing the matter. Since accidents were down in potions, most of which Snape credited to having made Neville Longbottom practice, and there were several upper years who were lying in a heap in a storage cupboard while awaiting MacDrake draft, keeping the usual sources of the more dangerous incidents occupied overall, it was a safer year than Hogwarts had seen in decades. No one commented on the fact that there was a giant letter of dismissal hanging in the entrance hall, nor that no one from the Board of Governors had actually come by to make sure that Dumbledore had gone. Most people treated it as just another part of life in the castle, and moved on to trying to do their homework and get persons of the gender of their interest into broom closets for some study of anatomy, a course not offered at Hogwarts. Officially, and generally be students. Defense classes had remained somewhat noteworthy, and every student got used to having gleeful house elves gather around them as they left the room to collect their gore-smeared robes for cleaning, while a small fight broke out over who got to prepare the room for Mr. Kind and Good Harry Potter's next class. In a way, it became a fact of life. On the other hand, most of the students continued to suffer nightmares of everything from severed limbs to vivisection to exploding bodies. And then there were the parts of their dreams that were actually memories from class. Harry demonstrated a positive genius for coming up with new minutiae to teach. Even the older years were being forced to learn. In their cases, it was less a matter of new spells and more learning to apply them in what Harry considered to be proper manners. Harry also had temporarily changed the name of the class to Aggressive Defense Against the Dark Arts on the grounds that the best defense was a corpse for an opponent. Things kept slipping his mind though. He kept getting distracted before he got around to asking questions. Around Easter, messages began to crop up on the walls, written in a variety of different bloods. They caused some comment at first, but after a while, they got to be boring. The author seemed to be getting increasingly frustrated at the lack of fear in the castle, judging from the ever more erratic writing. In time, they would have become blasé on their own, but Fred decided to get in on the fun using bright, day-glow colors. Soon, there were messages on the wall calling for the underthings of the ladies of the castle to bedeck the suits of armor and threats that if treacle were not offered as pudding, that the sky would be green forevermore. And then they decided to indulge themselves and get crazy. It escalated quickly too. By the end of April, the Great Hall had been completely covered in graffiti several layers deep with warring threats of dire horrors to come, and that the Muffin King was riding forth to attack the biscuits of Bruges and lay siege to the home of the Mad Wizard of Twinkle. No one was sure how the artists had managed to deface even the ceiling, so that there was skywriting overhead calling for terror at the might of the air, and calling everyone who read it a stupid wanker for having read it. Everyone thought that the whole thing had come to a head when the two sides decided to work on different places. The entrance hall was soaked in blood, which would have worried people, but everyone figured that someone had used the blood from Harry's classes. The elves couldn't manage to clean it all right. From floor to ceiling. That same morning, the outside of the astronomy tower was painted as a giant penis with a long poem glorifying the female form in general, and the naughty bits in particular with reference to a selection of vulgarities and suggestions for acts normally not discussed in polite company, along with a complete set of footnotes, 3 feet high, citing the books and pages where pictures of everything described could be found in the library, which led to Madame Pants closing it for an extended period. Until the staff were able to get across to the male half of the student body that the books in question didn't really exist. Fred and George did a brisk trade in postcards for some time after though. It turned out that everyone had been wrong. Things really came to a head over the week after. While the library was closed to prevent horny adolescents from rampaging through in a search for mythical books, Fred maintained that they were actually suggestions for books that should be added to the school's collection. The heir took to stunning random students and writing messages on them. Unfortunately, the heir had reckoned without the twins' need to outdo everyone. 3 days after that facial writing began, the entirety of Hufflepuff was ambushed by 2 masked individuals with red hair who finished each other's sentences, and who proceeded to cover each student with part of an obscene limerick that could only be read by having all the students stand in the correct order, which Dumbledore had them do in front of the Great Hall so everyone could see. No one was able to identify the authors of the poem. The trial of Gilderoy Lockhart began in March. As a result of this, Dumbledore had to spend a good bit of time away from the castle. Not only was this the sort of high-profile case that the chief warlock was expected to oversee, but he was one of only a handful of members who weren't being called as complaining witnesses and might, therefore, be something vaguely resembling impartial. Lucius Malfoy kept trying to ask what Dumbledore was doing when not presiding, but after Dumbledore began to reply to each instance of the question with "your wife," adding a lewd pelvic thrust, Malfoy stopped. Madame Bones had spared no expense on the overtime, it seemed, since her aurors had turned up a truly impressive pile of evidence and more witnesses that could be easily fit into a magically expanded space. As a result, the prosecution's case went on for day after day as the head of the DMLE, in her role as prosecution for the Crown, laid letter after letter before the 4 who were hearing the case, seeing as they were the only ones left for a panel normally consisting of 7 to 13. It took her almost a whole week just to depose the various members of the Wiesengemot who had either received letters personally or whose close family had gotten a Lockhart special. And then there were the panties returned from the man's collection. Harry read the accounts by stealing Draco Malfoy's paper and ignoring the subsequent complaints at the top of a wheedling voice. It was with amusement that he discovered that it was not only the paper that was making things up. He was nearly certain that Madame Bones was a bit too zealous in the discharge of her duties, because he knew full well he hadn't written some of those letters that were being offered as evidence. There was an open letter in the paper from the Queen asking that the sender of the letter to her bed with an owl pellet as a pillowment be buried so deeply under the law that by the time he or she was found, that person had long since withered to dust. It was noted by the editors that the wording had been heavily modified to prevent shock by coarse, Muggle language. Apparently a second letter had been sent to Madame Bones offering any assistance the Queen's magical bench needed, but had been politely informed that the DMLE was already about as invested as it could get, given that the director had received one of those letters. There were rumors that the Queen and Madame Bones were pen pals now. It was probably a bad sign that Lockhart's lawyer seemed to have given up even suing the newspaper for some of the more inflammatory articles published calling for, at the least, the slow execution of the once golden darling of the press. On the other hand, it might have been because it would have tied up a good-sized firm of barristers for decades just to file all the court papers, given the sheer number of things to sue over. The trial dragged on, taking far longer than it should have. The prosecution seemed to be taking a positive delight in drawing things out. It was long gone Easter before the prosecution finished with the salacious details of the various letters and move on to a series of increasingly serious and vast crimes. Harry had thought that it was some sort of strange April Fool's prank at first, but quickly realized that Madame Bones was in fact charging Lockhart with everything she could think of. He suspected the Queen's hand in it. The reason he'd thought that it was some sort of prank was that Lockhart was being charged with robbing the British Museum of several interesting pieces, including a rapier and a collection of papers from its vaults. Over the following days, more charges surfaced. Lockhart was charged with being involved in a conspiracy to embarrass an official of Her Majesty's government by use of a two-paid, porcine saboteur, a massive traffic jam resulting in deaths throughout the major London metropolitan area, bringing a Muggle into Diagon Alley, the ongoing abduction of Muggle prisoners, and the deaths of 3 random people who fell off a bridge. For the next month, the charges grew more and more elaborate. Lockhart was accused of being involved in the kidnapping of Patty Hearst, the deaths of all of the Kennedys, including those still alive, the disappearance of Jimmy Hoffa and Amelia Earhart, the destruction of the Hindenburg, the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, the Opium Wars, the Gunpowder Plot, the death of King Charles II and Mary, Queen of Scots, the sinking of the Titanic, the mysterious deaths of several prostitutes in Whitechapel, blackmailing a Bohemian king, killing a man on a train headed east very quickly, the disappearance of the Lindbergh baby, the bombing of Dresden, running a crime ring out of an exclusive London hotel, the invention of penicillin, leading the Light Brigade and the Heavy Brigade, the British invasion, wasting good tea by tossing it into a dirty harbor. While wearing a silly outfit, domestication of Gallus domesticus, enameling an avian statue belonging to the Hospitallers of the Knights of St. John, the loss of 13 valuable colonies, the moon landing, stealing firearms from an armory, the invention of role-playing games, the Watergate break-in, the massacre at the Alamo, Gettysburg, the American Civil War, the English Civil War, the death of Jeanne d'Arc, the 100 Years' War, the theft of the Sphinx's nose, the crash of the American stock market, the crash of the American stock market, the Chicago fire, prohibition, women's suffrage, moonshine, the fall of Troy, the burning of Alexandria, the burning of Alexandria, the burning of Alexandria, the Tower of Babel, the sinking of a castle into a swamp, the sinking of a castle into a swamp. A swamp. The building of a castle on top of 2 sunken castles, the Big Bang, the Leaning Tower of Pisa, the separating of Pangaea, Tiananmen Square, lies, damn lies, statistics, fooling a royal into going nude, Sputnik, the USSR, modern art, postmodern art, the sale of the Eiffel Tower, the sale of the Eiffel Tower, the October Revolution, yellow fever, disco, hippies, driving drunk, importation of opium poppies, the kidnapping of Fay Ray, the death of Kurt Cobain, pineapple on pizza, light beer. Typhoid Mary, original sin, theft of fire from the gods, and the Queen's recent head cold. Things went a bit sideways and citron-shaped on the 3rd of May. Harry had taken the morning off to collect some volunteers for his last 2 classes of the year. While he was out, he had let the air out of the tires of every vehicle in Buckingham Palace, made Big Ben run an hour fast, and held up London traffic for 10 minutes at lunchtime. He was eagerly awaiting Madame Bones asking to unrest her case, so that she could begin the process of adding further charges. Since the defense had so far mounted the defense of "fuck it, he's guilty," there was a good chance her request would be granted. Daphne? Yes, Harry? Daphne was finally getting more sleep as the threat of Astoria had made sure she practiced regularly. These days, she was managing to finish spells first and, as a result, her door stayed locked. Because of her increased sleep, she was now treating Harry with more polite distance than outright attempts at violence. "Where's Girl Toby?" Daphne looked around. "No idea." Where did he go?" Gred? "Yes." "Harry? Have you seen Girl Toby?" "Not recently," said Forge. "Not since she went to have a chat with our sister," added Fred. "Did you see the new bit of graffiti?" "Where'd he go?" Tom Riddle paced angrily back and forth. This had been a frustrating year. Never mind getting the stupid girl to do anything, why wasn't anyone taking this seriously? He'd put dozens of people into storage cupboards, what was with that, anyway? And no one cared. Why did no one respond when he'd painted the entrance hall with blood? That should have caused some comment. And why hadn't anyone died? Sure, it had taken a few tries last time, but now, and at least in his day, someone had cared that there had been attacks. Sure, no one really worried, but they'd taken notice. Now there was at least one student whose petrification hadn't even been mentioned. Not even in dismissive terms. No one seemed to care that the boy was even missing. There wasn't a note to the family or anything. What the hell? How hard was it to get some schoolchildren to at least pay attention? He'd have liked a little fear, but he'd have settled for something other than the astronomy tower becoming a giant phallic effigy. For some reason, that had been more noteworthy. And now HarryPotter wasn't even being properly heroic. Tom wasn't so sure about that one, though. Despite the attestations of the girl in his diary, what he'd managed to read from between the lines said that the boy wasn't even anything like she thought. But he didn't believe most of what she wrote, since she seemed to think that Dumbledore was allowing a student to teach. And that the student was gutting people as part of class. Still, the boy should be down here by now. He'd taken one of Potter's friends to ensure that the boy would show up. Of course, he wouldn't blame Potter for leaving her here, since she was only mercifully silent now because he'd knocked her out. What was keeping? Tom's pacing was interrupted by smacking into someone as he turned around. Hi. Chapter 34, Showdown in the Chamber of Secrets. Dumbledore sat behind his desk. Rather, he lounged, leaning back with his hands clasped over his stomach in some parody of a satisfied, fat man. Behind his spectacles, he stared vacuously at the man on the other side of the stretch of wood. He had been harangued for the better part of half an hour, and was slowly reaching the point where he was running out of Gobstone's moves in his head, and he didn't want to have to move on to the Hogwarts accounting, so he might cut the man off soon. Lucius Malfoy was well past flushed, and was now heading from dark red to purple in his fury. His normally perfect hair was wildly out of place as he screamed at a man who was infuriatingly calm. The fact that the old bastard was somehow apparently senile enough to stare off into space without apparent comprehension just made it worse. "I'm sorry, Lucius, I do believe I may have missed that last bit." "Which last bit?" "Since you walked in." "Gah. So why are you here?" "Gah. I assume it has to do with my missing student?" "Because one missing student is really not worth coming here about it." There was a grinding noise and both men looked at a bookshelf that had moved. So had the wall behind it, swinging inwards and dumping the books on the floor in the process. Standing in the secret passageway were HarryPotter with girl Toby over his shoulder and a small redhead mostly hiding behind the boy. Dumbledore blinked a few times. He had not known about that passage into his office. Well, since it appears that my missing student has been found, he gestured at the three people. That's cleared up. Thank you for visiting, Lucius. Do see yourself out. You were sacked. Funny thing that, Dumbledore smiled genially. I had a word with members of the board and every single one of them said that you blackmailed them into that vote. Lucius's face stayed its purpling hue, but was slowly shifting from contorted anger to outright confusion. I went and visited them, and they all agreed you had threatened their families. Most reprehensible. Lucius blinked. His face was starting to lose the coloring as he got sidelined. What? Harry snapped his fingers. That reminds me. He looked at Dumbledore. Is possession by dark spirits normal around here? Dumbledore's face took on a serious look as things shifted focus too quickly for him to continue looking absent-minded. What? Oh. No, not really. Why? Because one of the Weasleys was being possessed by a dark spirit out of a journal that he gave her. Harry gestured at Lucius Malfoy, who had gone suddenly pale. I'm sorry? Asked Dumbledore. What journal? He looked up. Where did Lucius go? His office door was open, and there was the sound of footsteps racing down the moving staircase. Harry pointed at the door. That way. Thank you. Happy to help. Now, what was this about a journal? He had a look of mild interest on his face. Harry tossed a plain, black book onto Dumbledore's desk and walked into the office proper. The wall swung shut behind him, leaving the bookcase where it stood in a pile of scattered texts. The man opened it to the first page, and his eyes widened slightly. Tom Marvolo Riddle. Hi, Professor Dumbledore, said a sheepish, high-pitched voice from behind Harry. Arthur and Molly Weasley were sitting in Dumbledore's office. They hadn't been here since they had been students and been caught repeatedly violating curfew. Technically, they had been violating other things as well, but those weren't quite as firmly against school rules. It was strange for them to be here now, although both privately suspected that it was because their twins had finally managed to do something so monumentally insane that the headmaster had been forced to address it directly. Even Molly's older brothers hadn't managed that feat, but their lads were making a good effort to replace those two or at least make everyone remember them more fondly by making their antics seem tamer by comparison. Dumbledore walked in and settled himself behind his desk. I'm sure you are wondering why you are here. In fact, I would wager that you expect that I am about to tell you that two of your children are about to be expelled or at least face serious discipline matters. I don't like how that sounds, said Arthur. And you probably shouldn't. I'll start with the good news, the twins are not in trouble. Although I would request that next time that they decide to paint the anatomy tower as a giant penis, that they use materials harder to remove so I do not have to listen to upset house elves about how easy it was to clean up. What? Molly's voice hadn't risen, but her face had taken on a thunderous quality. I have to admit that their poems about female anatomy were quite lost on me, but I'm told they were quite erotic. What? And I was thoroughly impressed with their work on transposition, so that when Aurora was walking up or down the stairs of the anatomy tower, the castle's entire supply of rice pudding was heated to about 98 degrees, and then launched from the top in a geyser. What? So, all in all, I have to say that they're doing quite well. And even then, I have to applaud them for having engaged in a prank war with Voldemort. He sighed as the two flinched and then flinched more as they registered what he said. Or rather, a shade of him possessing a student. Headmaster, began Arthur, uncertainly. Which rather brings me to the reason I called you here. Dumbledore rubbed his face for a moment. For once, I find myself a bit at a loss. So, I guess I'll just say it outright. Your daughter wrote in a cursed diary. Molly paled and Arthur covered his face with his hands. Unfortunately, we didn't find out in time. Dumbledore ignored the beginnings of sobs. Thankfully, one of our students was able to end the process before young Ginevra was completely annihilated. He paused. But I'm not sure there's a good way to explain the rest. Tom. Hi. A familiar girl waved from her seat off to the side. The Weasleys had been so distracted they had missed her, having expected to see the twins and simply glossed over anything that didn't fit that. Ginny. Molly dove at the girl and wrapped her in a death hug. Not exactly, managed the girl as she was smothered. What? Molly, if you would sit down? Dumbledore looked very tired. Thank you. Let me introduce you to Tom Marvolo Riddle. I should say that this is the new and rather improved version. The girl flushed a little and looked down sheepishly. And now I will let, her explain. She looked around helplessly. I'm Tom Marvolo Riddle. And a bit of Ginny Weasley. I have her memories and a bit of her personality, but when the transfer was stopped, there was more me in here than her. Molly's face was impressive in that it managed to be both scarlet with rage and alabaster pale in horror. I'm pretty sure it can't be undone, Dumbledore nodded slowly. I'm really sorry about this. Why did you do this? Asked Arthur. Well, I used to be a really bad person. Like budding Dark Lord bad. Ginny scratched her cheek. But somehow I got to see that I was on a bad path and want to stop. A pause. It's a lot more complicated than that, but I really don't know how to explain having a major change of heart because someone stared at me. What? Like I said, I don't get it either. But being angry seems like it was a lot of work. Another pause. But judging from what I know of Ginny, I seem to have adopted her moral compass. Somehow it feels like a fitting middle ground. Arthur blinked. He wobbled Molly, who was staring straight ahead, unmoving. May I have a few minutes with my wife? Just stay out of broom cupboards, Arthur, those are reserved for students and staff. Arthur blinked and then towed his wife from the room. The Weasleys returned to the office to see Dumbledore with a gigantic book open on his desk, and the person who had been Ginny reading over his shoulder. The man was muttering to himself as he went down columns of text. Possession by a Dark Lord, attempted possession by a Dark Lord, possession by a Light Lord, wasn't that a mess? Attempted possession by a Lord of somewhere in between. No, I don't think we've ever had a possession by a Dark Lord and reforming to a moderately good person at the same time. That's actually rather surprising, said the girl who, Arthur noticed, had red, glowing eyes. He wasn't sure how he'd missed that earlier. I mean, given the number of crazy things that happened here over the years. We'll be keeping her. Him. Arthur scratched his head. Come again? Asked Dumbledore. Ginny. Tom. Can I get a bit of help here? There's some of our daughter in there, explained Molly. And, well, we'll see how it goes over the summer at least. The red-headed girl blinked. Oh. Okay then. A pause. I've never had a place to go over the summer, so that should be new. Eep. The last was because a sad-looking Molly Weasley had scooped Tom Ginny up and was hugging her. But I do insist that we get this name and gender thing sorted out, said Arthur. I'm really not going to keep guessing what to say. Well, I'd like to keep the bookkeeping simple, said Dumbledore. So I insist that legally, the name and gender remain the same. He looked up at the ceiling for a moment. But we're going to have to do something about the dorm situation. But I'm not sure I want to be Ginny Weasley. Do what Professor Headmaster does, said Harry from the windowsill. Everyone jumped. Harry leaned to the side to avoid the bolt of dangerous energy from the young redhead's fingers. Just be Ginevra Tam Riddle Weasley. It's still fewer than he uses. Heh. Sorry about that. The newly minted Tam said. She was looking at her smoking hand. Bad habits die hard, and I was never good at being surprised. Don't worry, dear, said Molly. My twins will have you broken of the habit by the end of the summer. I'll remind them to duck, sighed Arthur. They're used to it with Ginny, replied Molly. To tell the truth, the only difference is that you didn't just try to animate their snot. I didn't try to what? I think you should take young Miss Riddle home early for the year. There's a good bit left to term, but I know that young Miss Riddle knows all of the first-year material, doesn't she? Yes, headmaster. So that will give me almost 5 months to work out how we're going to house her next year. If it helps, headmaster, I'm pretty sure I'm asexual. It doesn't. This is the kind of thing that the Board of Governors would rightly be upset by if I manage it wrong. Besides, I want to make sure no one is uncomfortable, and I doubt you'll want to think of yourself as a normal 12-year-old girl. True. Good. Molly, Arthur, please get her home and used to life in a family that actually likes each other. It should be a good experience. After May, things continued slightly calmer because Fred and Gred decided that with no one writing on the walls, it wasn't as much fun. That hadn't stopped them from writing the name and cup size of every girl from 3rd year and up on the walls of every bathroom. On the other hand, the trial of the century was in recess for 2 weeks to allow the Daily Prophet to conduct sufficient legal commentary on the case, which mostly boiled down to he's obviously guilty, and for the continued violation of the statutes of secrecy for continuing to use magic to kidnap prisoners from Muggle prisons charged to get updated. He was also charged with several juvenile pranks on the general British population, and causing the Queen to have a headache. Dumbledore was quoted as a crackpot old coot and all-around madman of the nuttiest caliber for suggesting that it might just be possible that Lockhart wasn't guilty of crimes committed after incarceration, seeing as how the Aurors were skilled enough to prevent a man literally unable to move his limbs with the number of chains on them from going anywhere, let alone managing spectacular feats of magic. Madame Bones, on the other hand, was quoted as the valiant defender of truth and integrity in the pursuit of justice for saying that the only reason she wasn't pushing for Lockhart to be kissed was because she was pushing for execution, and that it would be wasted. She also hoped that the idiot in charge of the court could see past his forgive everyone complex and convict the blatantly guilty monster of all charges, especially those he had managed after being arrested, as they were clearly dark magic. The day exams were set to begin. Dumbledore cheerfully announced that there were no exams this year. He admonished everyone to keep studying for the next week despite the lack of anyone checking on them, and that they should all stay out of broom cupboards since the prefects weren't going to be patrolling. Harry? Yes, Daphne? They were sitting in a compartment on the Hogwarts Express, headed back to London. Hermione had her head buried in a book and was still muttering uncomplimentary things about Dumbledore for the lack of finals. Pansy was reading a book on motorcycle maintenance in an attempt to be able to learn to ride before Harry got involved. Blaise was chatting with Tracy about precious gems, something his mother had a vested interest in, and Millicent was reading the Daily Prophet, which had the headline Lockhart guilty. No1 shocked, and the story detailed how he had fallen from grace so horribly and was being taken to maximum security for execution in the morning. Girl Toby was elsewhere in the train, judging from the shrieks of not glee. I've been meaning to ask. What did you get me for Christmas? HM? Oh. I got you a note. What else? What else? There was a huge box. Yes. And it had breathing holes cut out of it. Yes. And you left me a note to feed it twice a day. Yes. What was it? What was what? What was the note about? I wanted to make sure you didn't forget to feed girl Toby. You, what? She needs to eat. She's a growing girl. And the breathing holes? Made the package lighter. Errrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrrr attempt to strangle him, dumping her in Blaze's lap. "Hello, Daphne. Are you feeling all right?" "Okay then." He had grabbed her arm and held her so she didn't embarrass herself trying to attack Harry again. Hari took a nap. I'll drop in before school, promised Hari. Please don't, answered his friends. See you then. Hari vanished from the platform in a flash of fire. Aurors came storming onto the platform. Everyone maintains an orderly exit. We're on the lookout for a highly dangerous escapee from Azkaban. About 6 weeks ago. Itachi. Itachi looked up from a report detailing an increase in the solvency of brothels in hot water country. He was trying to decide if there were just a bunch of nobles on vacation, or if it might mean something useful. Yes, Leader-sama? You. The orange-haired man shook himself. Come with me. Itachi shrugged and followed. Tell me, Itachi, said Pain. What is that? It appears to be a giant snake filling your office. Indeed, it is, Itachi. Why is it there? I have no idea. Perhaps Toby knows? Pain twitched. I already asked him. Besides, please note the insufferable red pigeon sitting on it looking smug. I see it, Leader-sama. I suspect, therefore, that your son is responsible for my entire office now being unusable. Just a question here, Leader-sama. Since you already know what it is and why it is there, what do you need from me? Itachi? Yes, Leader-sama? Do not piss me off. Have you tried talking to it? What? You can speak to snakes, right? I forgot about that. But it's unconscious anyway. That was the other reason I suspected Hari. Someone hit it hard enough to knock it out, but not kill it. Who else would do that and then send it to me? A good question, Leader-sama. I recommend talking to it when it wakes up. I have paperwork to do you mind if I go? It seems to be stirring. Hey, Pain. Kakuzu walked into the room. I have a case. Chapter 35, When Someone Looks a Basilisk in the Eyes. Where do you bury the survivors? Hi, Dad. Itachi looked up at his son, who was standing on the windowsill, looking cheerful. Hey, Hari. You may want to avoid Kakuzu for a bit. Why? The snake you sent killed his lightning heart again. Hari snapped his fingers. That reminds me. He ran off into the tower. Uncle Pain. I need to tell you something about the snake. Itachi rubbed his face slowly and then rose and began heading to the meeting hall to head off Kakuzu. Uncle Pain? Yes? Snarled the orange-haired man as he did paperwork on his lap. His desk was still covered in scorch marks. I wanted to tell you that the snake I sent you can kill with a look. Pain twitched. Then he glared at the heat chicken on his desk, which he felt sure was laughing at him. Can you come to the meeting room? I have gifts. Hari ran out of the room and absently ducked under a fireball his uncle threw at him. I'm going to give you such a beating, you brat. A spear of wind flew from Hari's hands. God's damn it. Kakuzu was still grumbling about needing another lightning heart when the Akatsuki gathered in the meeting area to find out what Hari had brought back from his time abroad. Hari himself was bouncing on his toes, holding a pile of boxes. Here you go, Uncle Kakuzu, Uncle Haiden, Uncle Zetsu. Hari had dodged Kakuzu's half-hearted attempt to cuff him in the head. Uncle Toby, cream filling? The last remark was because Toby had plucked a pie from nowhere and smushed it into Hari's face. It probably would have done more than that, but Hari had begun dodging early, and so mostly got pie everywhere. Tasty. Uncle Kisame and Conan, Uncle Pain, Uncle Deidara. He paused. Dad. He turned to the redhead. You'll be sharing with Uncle Zetsu. Let's see what you got me, brat, grumbled Kisame. He opened the small box and frowned when a sharp bark came out. You didn't get me a dog. Kisame lifted a puppy made mostly of dewy eyes from the box and glared as it produced a tongue from somewhere and licked his palm. You got me a dog. Nope. Hari smiled. Kisame looked at the thing which had begun to bark happily. You sure? He poked it, and it licked his finger. I'm pretty sure this is a dog. It's a krup. Is that why it has two tails? Yep. So, you got me a dog. No. It's a krup. It's a dog. It's magical. It's a dog. It'll go with your kneesel. My what? Oh. Right. The kitten. A furred head poked up from the back of Kisame's collar and mewed. Damn it, I told you to stay hidden around here. The cheerful Mew drew a scowl. Zetsu unwrapped what appeared to be a training dummy with a tree growing out of its head. Hey! It looks just like Daddy. Then it started to scream. All the ninja grumbled until the black half of Zetsu cold-cocked the thing in the face, sending it to the ground. He then proceeded to stomp on its throat until it stopped making noise. Uncle Sasori, said Hari, you should try seeing if it would make good puppets. Okay? As long as you leave the head planted in good soil, it'll grow back. Okay then. Sasori looked a little concerned about this concept. Living wood people were normal for him, planting them and cutting off the grown parts? Not so much. Toby was holding something and glaring at it. It was mask-shaped inside its wrapping. You got me my own, he trailed off as the paper fell to the floor. Monster mask. Of course, it's yours, Hari replied. I got it for you. Toby held up a rubbery Frankenstein's monster mask. This is not my mask. Yes, it is. Gah. Toby threw the mask down. Where is my spare mask? He roared. I needed it. You what? I had to give a gift. Toby just stared in silence for almost a minute as everyone watched. Then he stormed out of the room, cursing. Why isn't he like that normally, yeah? Deidara asked. From somewhere in the tower, there came the sounds of rippling explosions, and increasingly high-pitched shrieks of various curses in new and inventive litanies. Pain shrugged. I should probably do something about that before he wrecks my tower. There was an incoherent bellow of rage. When he's a little calmer. Let's see what you got me, yeah. Deidara pulled away the wrapping, deciding to ignore the fact that the world was shifting suddenly, primarily on the grounds that sudden shifts in the world were like explosions, and those were good, yeah. Inside was a large box labeled ammonium nitrate/fuel oil. Handle with care. What's this stuff, yeah? I'll show you how it works later, Uncle Deidara. When Pain wasn't looking, Hari moved his hands apart suddenly, and mouthed Bai-Ig boom to Deidara. Kakuzu was staring at a comb larger than his hand made of solid gold. Where did you get this? The previous defense teacher. Is it even usable? No idea. Hari paused. Probably. It's not like hair is particularly hard. Someone made a solid gold comb. I could kill someone by throwing this. Why would someone make this? Dunno. I'm guessing the answer is something along the lines of because, Uncle Kakuzu. That sounds distressingly possible. What the hell is this? Haydn was holding a box bearing the legend Victoria's Secret. Angel Show. I got them for you. Why would you get me panties? Haydn had pulled out a lacy black thong. Do I look like I wear panties? He gave a delicate sniff. Used panties. I thought it would go well with Aunt Conan's favorite pair in your sock drawer. Haydn barely had time to go paler than usual before he was blown through the wall by a stream of explosive tags. The barrage continued to fire at him as he fell, raining explosions on the crater at the base of the tower as Conan screamed in fury. She eventually stopped and sighed. I needed that. She flung a few more tags down, just as the few operable bits of Haydn were collecting themselves, and then went to open her gift. What did you? She slammed the lid shut, her face scorching red. The air around her head was rippling with distinct heat haze. Then she slowly opened it slightly, and looked inside again before slamming it shut once more, looking like someone had given subcutaneous injections of tomato juice. Do you like them? Why is one of them covered in spikes? It's based on the book in your favorite pile. Conan made an eep sound. Can I see how? Pain had been leaning over and reeled back, clutching his forehead where a paper shuriken had speared his skull. Okay then, not going to ask. You got your gift already, Uncle Pain. I punched it in the face for you. I'm aware. Your animal path now has a fun new toy. Yummy. Pain coughed. I'll be right back. He left the room. On his way downstairs, there was the sound of fireballs being thrown and suddenly cut off, along with a cessation of cursing, except from the bits of Haydn currently belaboring Kakuzu to come down and put him back together. Itachi had been unwrapping his gift and looked down at a poorly made mug with "World's Best" dash on it. The line had Bab etched over it by someone whose grasp of spelling was matched only by a lack of skill at engraving. Thanks, son. I thought it would go well with your shirt. Yes, it will. Itachi punched Kisame in the face when the shark man didn't stop snickering. There was a thump as the huge swordsman landed on the remains of Haydn, followed by cursing. And an angry mew. Then more cursing. Conan shuffled out of the room with her box, trying to pretend it wasn't there. Hari? Yes, Uncle Deidara? Is now a good time? Sure. Dad? I got something for Uncle Sasuke. Think I should mail it to Leaf? Or deliver it in person? In person, it'll get you out of the tower while Leader Sama calms down. There's just one thing. Hari sat on Itachi's bed. Yeah? Your uncle, well. Is he dead? Because it's not fair, I wanted to kill him. Itachi sighed and rubbed his face. No. He left Leaf for Sound. I wanted him to stay in Leaf. It's important that he not go missing mean, and besides I wanted him safe. Hari? Itachi looked around at the empty room. Uchiha Sasuke was practicing with a sword when something hugged him from behind. Hi, Uncle Sasuke. Dad says HN. Then the world went dark. Hari strolled through Sound's lab complex with his uncle over his shoulder. Sometimes he had to stop someone and interrogate him, or her to check what exactly the various rooms were. The Byakugan was a wonderful tool, but it would have helped if people had labeled things. Then he usually let the person go. Or cut a head off. Whichever. It took a good bit of time to find something that sounded appropriately worth further investigation. He noted absently the snake man running through the complex, searching each room thoroughly and screaming at people he passed. Hari wondered what that was about. Old lady? Tsunade's head turned, ready to punch Naruto in the face, while wondering what her brat was doing back early. Instead, she found a boy wearing an Akatsuki robe sitting on her windowsill. The boy's hair obscured half his face, but the visible half was pale, and she couldn't help noticing the whirling Sharingan eye staring at her. Hey, old lady? Do you know where the Hokage is? She was having some trouble responding to this. It was too sudden for her to process that someone wasn't up on the times and thought someone else was Hokage. She recalled seeing something about this in the notes on the explosion a year ago. Someone matching this rough description had been waving a severed arm and running through the streets, hadn't he? She really needed a drink. Well, when you see the Hokage, would you tell him to keep a better eye on my uncle this time? A dark shape was tossed onto her desk. It was only the sudden realization that it was her missing Uchiha that stayed her hand as it was about to punch him into paste. Cool. See you. The freakish boy was gone and one of her ANBU came bursting in the door. Hokage. That boy had to be a Byakugan. Tsunade sighed. The bound and gagged boy on her desk made noises that sounded rather rude, so she flicked him on the forehead for his language absently, and then rubbed her eyes. Get me a noichi and a medical team. Someone write a letter telling our esteemed head of the Uchiha Pro Tem that the actual head has turned up and, as a result, I will not be entertaining his request to have Leaf's official dish changed to noodles with broth in. Oh. And someone tell Shizen that I've decided to get off the wagon, and she should get me a fuck ton of booze before I go to a bar to get it myself. She paused. Why did he call me old? I mean, she squeezed her assets, I have my illusion up and running. She noticed a little drop of blood on Sasuke's nose. And someone tell my apprentice that Sasuke is back. There was a whimper. You broke her heart, you can explain to her. More whimpering. Suck it up. Why did the Uchiha have a ball gag in his mouth? That ropework looked like. Where's my booze? Hey Dad. Hi, Uncle Pain. Harry? Pain spoke with a certain wariness to his voice. That might have been because his best friend had been distinctly touchy for a few days and, judging from the abrupt mood swing and return to normal, his theoretical superior was having some kind of breakdown. Also, Deidara had gleefully managed to use most of a metric ton of ANFO before Pain had managed to catch up to the mad bomber of stone and take the rest off of him. Where have you been? Sound. Then Leaf. All right. That's good. Pain was adopting the tone of one who was dealing with the heart of thinking, or someone being deliberately obtuse, or maybe just an Uchiha. Why? Well, I needed to get Uncle Sasuke back to Leaf, so I had to get him from Sound. Of course. Pain rubbed his face for a moment. I should have known. It's so obvious, after all. Did you blow up anything? No. In Leaf? Definitely not. How are you so sure? Asked Pain, a man aware that Hari had only melee combat and large-scale chakra attacks. All I did was drop off Uncle Sasuke. Drop who off? Asked Kisame as he walked into the briefing room. Uncle Sasuke. That's what I thought you said. Isn't he in Sound? Not anymore. If I may? Pain interjected, might I ask what qualifies as drop-off in your mind? I had already tied up Uncle Sasuke the way I learned from Conan's books. Pain had covered his face and moaned as Kisame started snickering and Itachi sighed and rubbed his eyes. So he wasn't saying much through the ball gag. Kisame began to gasp for air. Hayden walked into the room. I heard someone say ball gag? Kisame pointed at Hari. He tied up Itachi's little brother like a gay fetish doll. Hayden covered his mouth and managed to be out of the room before the gales of laughter echoed through the tower. Hari? Said Pain, would you please finish? And so, I tossed him onto the Hokage's desk, and asked the old lady there to let the Hokage know I was returning Uncle Sasuke, and please keep a better eye on him this time. Did. Pain began and stopped. What did she look like? Hari frowned. Tallish, good muscles, blonde hair. Lots of wrinkles and sagging breasts. Pain relaxed, there were plenty of retired ninja who could qualify. And she had some illusion up and a concentration of chakra on her forehead. And there went his mellow. Hari? Did you call her old lady? Well, yeah. She was one. Kisame fell to the floor, clutching his sides. Itachi had ceased rubbing his eyes, and was just staring into space. Pain was looking into the distance with the face of a man trying to gauge whether a major military power was about to declare war. Conan poked her head in. Why was Hayden lying in the hallway laughing before I kicked him in the balls? She asked in the tone of someone who was still working out her anger. Hari. Kisame struggled for air. Hari kidnapped his uncle Sasuke and delivered him tied up with a ball gag in his mouth because he learned from your books. Conan went brilliantly red and fled. Kisame looked sad he hadn't gotten a chance to tell her about Hari calling one of the sages an old lady. There was something that Pain had been meaning to ask, and this seemed like a good time. It would let him think about something other than the absurd number of S-Class ninja in Leaf. Seriously, aside from the Akatsuki in Leaf, who had more than 2 on staff. Coming by to explain their displeasure. Hari? Yes, Uncle Pain? What's that mark on your neck? Prototype curse mark. Of course. Itachi blinked. Wait. What? Itachi grabbed Hari, ignoring the attempt to dodge without noticing. Curse mark? Yeah. I got it when I was in sound. I figured. Did. Itachi didn't want to ask, but he had to know. Did Orochimaru touch you? Did who touch me? Pale man, black hair. Like snakes? I think I saw him. He was a few levels away and shouting at people, Hari said. I'm not sure why he seemed so excited while I was going through the labs. So not from a bite. The mark? No. I put it on from a scroll. I see. Yeah. Hari's neck itched slightly where the 6 curled lines had formed a sort of star. Hari? Yes, Uncle Pain? Why do you have a bunch of scrolls on your back? I wanted to have the notes with me so I can make it work properly. I see. Why didn't you just memorize them? I was busy. I figured I'd look at them later. Not too busy to grab an experimental curse mark, though? Of course not. Right. I shouldn't have asked. Does it work? Not yet. I'm planning to fix it. Fix it? Pain's voice was flat. Yeah. I'm already taking runes and arithmancy this year, so it should be doable. Leader-sama? Yes, Itachi? Could you have the human path to come here a moment? Okay. Itachi hadn't let go of Hari, who was torn between hugging his father and being annoyed that he was being treated like a child. When the human path entered the room, Hari was held out like an offering. Check to make sure there aren't any passengers. The human path poked the mark on Hari's neck. Nope. Nothing here. It trotted out. Itachi put his son down. It was then that he noticed something that he'd overlooked while worried about his son's health. Why are you heavier? Hari held a leg out, showing orange leg warmers around his shins, then demonstrated similar objects on his wrists and across his torso. I'm having to work really hard to move like this. I see. Just wondering here, how did you get them? I picked them up in Leaf. Itachi closed his eyes in silent prayer. While you were out, did you make any other acquisitions? I got a book for Aunt Conan. Oh gods, muttered Itachi. And I helped do a little tidying up around the place. I'm not going to ask. I feel certain I will learn of it sooner or later. All right. Hari slowly made his way out of the room. Just a short while ago, Leaf. Wham. Lee. Haruno Sakura knew that the boy was pretty much indestructible, but it was hard not to worry when he had gone from jogging along at his steady, fast pace to accelerating through Leaf's exterior wall, and then into the memorial stone. She was somehow less worried that her former teacher had been then struck by the combination of Lee and stone at terminal velocity. That was probably because the man had already dusted himself off and was frantically patting his pockets with ever-increasing urgency. Lee, on the other hand, was also hauling himself up, but looked horrible. His face burned as he saw Sakura and realized he'd just acted like a complete fool in front of her. Lee? Yes, Sakura-chan? He asked in a subdued version of his usual shout. Where are your weights? Right here, Sakura-chan. Lee broke off as he actually looked at his limbs and noticed a distinct lack of weights. Gai-sensei. There was a crack of the sound barrier snapping, and then Guy stood in the spot occupied by the memorial stone. Youth. What is wrong, my honest not at all favorite student? I could sense your distress from across the village, and made my way here as quickly as possible so that I might aid you. Youth! Youth! Cried Lee, plaintively. My most honorable teacher, I have lost my prized weights, which you gave to me when I declared my intent to prove that I could be a successful ninja without chakra. I have failed you in their loss and dishonored you in failing. Youth! My dear student, I understand your worry, but perhaps the solution is simple? Have you tried looking where you last had them? Lee looked at his ankles. Youth! Yes. Youth! Oh. That is much more worrying. Let me consider what must be done. I think that in this instance, we are forced to concede that we cannot remedy this vexing issue on our own and must go to the leader of our fair village, that she might have a greater understanding of matters and bequeath to us what knowledge we lack so that we can solve this mystery. Come, Kakashi, you should come with us. Kakashi was still patting his pockets desperately and didn't seem to be paying attention as the two green beasts made their way to the Hokage Tower, towing him along. Sakura was left standing in the field, trying to work out what she had just missed. When the two and Kakashi, who now had sweat running down his face as he went through his pockets, got to the Hokage's office, they found a very annoyed-looking Ibiki and an ANBU wearing a spider mask who gave no sign of being frustrated, but there was somehow a sensation of great displeasure. The Hokage was sitting at her mound of sake bottles. There was probably a desk under there somewhere, and had just pulled the cork out of a bottle with her teeth and taken a great swig. Run that by me again. I think I'm about drunk enough, she said, voice as steady as ever. I came back from lunch and found that every last door in TNI didn't squeak. Ibiki's tone implied that this was a concern. It made sense, given that a squeaky door made it that much more difficult to sneak around if someone were trying to escape. Someone had oiled the hinges. You think that's bad? There was an undercurrent of fury in the ANBU's voice. My squad was the first back from patrol, so we found out first. Someone had swapped around the underwear in everyone's lockers. And then we found out that whoever had done that also left poison ivy oil on all of the stuff too. So, you're telling me that my entire commando unit is commando now? Asked Tsunade, her eyes clear. She tossed the now empty jug behind her, and got to work on the next. Yes, Hokage-sama. The ANBU was distinctly aware that she was in the presence of the man who had been her captain, and was relieved and worried to find that he was now looking downcast if not outright despondent instead of looking perverse. Tsunade sighed. What's wrong, Kakashi? Someone. Kakashi seemed to be having trouble wrapping his head around the concept. Someone stole my limited edition, personally signed copy of Ica 1. Worrying, I guess, but it was in my pocket. Okay then. I will regret this, I'm sure, but Guy, what brings you and your green mini-clone? Youth. So that the rest of us can understand, Guy. My apologies. Someone stole Lee's weights. I'm going to take a wild guess and say he was wearing them. Yes, Hokage-sama. Pause. On a related note, I must report that the memorial stone needs to be reseated. Why? When his weights went missing, Lee went through the wall and into it. Another pause. You might want to have someone fix the wall too. What a novel idea. I am most sorry, Hokage-sama. At that moment, Shizune came bursting through the door. And what new, minor but still worrying emergency are you reporting? Asked Tsunade, apparently bored as she took another draught of sake. When Uchiha Sasuke was brought to a room in the hospital, there was a gift on his bed, waiting for him. I'm guessing it all can be traced back to an incident last year. Guy, do you recall fighting Itachi? You mean that miserable, no good, vile, dirty, rotten, despicable, monstrous. Actually, I was referring to the young boy who kept calling him Dad, Guy. You might remember it, since I read in the report you wrote about how he was waving, and I'm quoting here some things stick in the mind: a severed arm with Sharingan implanted in it, and saying he'd killed Shimura Danzo. Ah, yes, Guy said gravely. The unfortunate product of the Uchiha program of forced incest. Or something, replied Tsunade, sober as a judge. That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfictions. Looking forward to having you on board again.